All right, so we are rejoined actually today by one of our favorite guests in the world, Ali Benevento, an attorney at the Strom Law Firm, but more importantly, someone who is well known in the FITSNews office for putting me in my place on the reg, so to speak. Ali, thank you for joining us. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for making the time.
Everyone's very excited about this conversation because they are very aware of your ability to not only argue your beliefs passionately and eloquently and effectively and persuasively, but your ability to kind of put the person you're speaking with kind of off their game a little bit. In fact, I'm feeling it already. How do you do that?
I have no idea what you're talking about. Carry on.
Fair enough. So we wanted to talk today about justice, and I previewed this in one of our previous shows as a debate on the death penalty, which we're going to talk about. You have some strong feelings, I have some strong feelings, but I wanted to have that conversation in the broader context of justice because it's something you fight for on a daily basis here in South Carolina. It's something I think I fight for on a daily basis. We have often been at loggerheads as to what that means, but let's start out with the conception of justice. I know it's important to you. Tell me, Ali Benevento, your conception of justice. What is it?
It is doing the right thing, even when that is a difficult decision or an unpopular decision. It is doing one's best to be ethical and moral and fair. Sometimes fair is not always easy to do, but I do believe that no matter what we are doing or in what context we do it, we should be striving towards justice and equity. And specifically in the context of the criminal justice system, which is where I spend a lot of my time, this concept, I believe, especially recently, has been skewed. We all have preconceived notions about what we think justice is in a particular context. It's a difficult analysis. I acknowledge that. But it's not always as simple, I think, as people make it seem. And one example would be if we hear about a crime that is committed or a case that's in the news, everyone behind a keyboard, all the Twitter warriors come out, and everybody has their own idea about what justice might be in that particular scenario. But what we miss is that there are pieces of things that we don't see or hear about or know about when we read about something in the media or if we are an outside observer. Whereas the parties to that case, whether that's the prosecutor, the defendant, the defense attorney, the victims, the judge, they have a unique perspective. And they are best suited, or should be, to say what a just outcome might be in the case. And that should be a joint goal, right? I'm not fighting for a deal or a break or to get someone off when I'm representing a criminal defendant. Just like a prosecutor, a good prosecutor is not fighting for the harshest possible penalty in every case, and the judge is not there to, you know, lay the hammer down on every single person. The collective goal of all of the parties should be a just outcome for all involved, for the
So it shouldn't
criminal
be
defendant.
adversarial, is what you're saying. It shouldn't be us versus them or them versus whoever, the judge versus whatever. It should be a harmonious process. Is that
Well, in our quest towards justice, yes. Obviously, from a practical standpoint, it is the state of South Carolina versus
yeah?
whoever. But as it relates to justice and a just outcome, that should be a joint goal, and that should
Mm.
always be our goal in every case.
What did you mean? You said it's been recently skewed, the debate. What did you mean by that? How so?
There is, or there seems to be, for somebody like me who spends a lot of time around the criminal justice system, a recent trend towards viewing the harshest possible penalties or the most extreme penalties in any case, regardless of circumstances, regardless of the person accused or convicted, as the only acceptable outcome, or that is the just outcome. For example, every murder should be treated the same, and every murderer deserves the death penalty, for example. And obviously, I'm intentionally exaggerating, but there does seem to be a trend towards this this thirst for, or this demand for, extreme punishments or outcomes in all criminal cases, regardless of nuance or regardless of
A
circumstances,
return to the days of Hammurabi, in other words, correct?
in a lot of ways.
Well, let me ask you this, though. When we look at what has led us to that
Hmm.
recalibration, would you not agree that on some level that recalibration is a result of a justice system that has failed to hold a lot of these violent criminals accountable, which has re-victimized a lot of victims, whether
Mm.
it's murder victims, families, whether it's sexual assault victims? Uh, would you not agree that that recalibration isn't happening in a vacuum, Ellie?
Oh, it's definitely not happening in a vacuum. I would agree with you on that. And let me just say this. I mean, I think so if you asked 10 people how many of them have ever been the victim of a crime, I bet you it would be a lot more than you think. And obviously everybody is not the victim of a very serious crime like an armed robbery or burglary or a sexual assault or doesn't know somebody in their immediate family who's been murdered, for example. But a lot of people have been victims of crimes. When you are the victim of a crime, that is a deeply personal, deeply emotional, traumatizing, potentially life-altering experience. And you are going to view everything that happens in that case from that very emotional perspective. And it is for that reason that we don't have vigilante justice in this country. We don't allow somebody who's been wronged to go out and take the law into her own hands to handle business. We allow the courts to do that. We allow due process, and we have an independent jurist to decide if a person is convicted or found responsible for breaking the law, what is an appropriate consequence in the context of what happened and who that person is, what their motivations are, for example. We don't allow people to go out and do that themselves. The judge does that.
Mhm. Well, forgive my, and again, I don't want to get into our political affiliations, but I would argue that the liberal obsession with Luigi Mangione, or the
It's a
shooter of
great
the United
example.
Healthcare, I mean, that seems to be as warm an embrace of vigilante justice as I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. So that case is wild. I've been following it. I'm looking forward to continuing to follow it. I actually just saw that his lawyers filed a motion to try to keep the federal government from pursuing the death penalty in that case.
Mhm.
You know, I and again, without getting into political affiliation, I am equally as disturbed by leftist extremism as I am conservative extremism, right? Like, and we do seem to be in a place where we see the most of extremism on either side. And I think Luigi's case is a good example of you have people, and let me hold on, let me back up. So Luigi has not been found guilty of a crime. He has been arrested, he has been charged. I understand that there may be some video surveillance footage that's probably pretty like the guy might be on video shooting Brian Thompson, right?
Right.
And let's assume for the sake of this conversation that he is responsible for that death, okay?
Proudly, some would say.
That's wild. And that I think should disturb people to their core. When we start to justify the taking of a human life for some philosophical purpose, or we think that we are justified in killing someone because of something they're affiliated with or some belief that they hold or some set of values that they ascribe to, that is a very dangerous path to go down. And so using Luigi as an example, if this is a young man who murdered a husband and father in cold blood in the middle of a New York City street because he had some abstract philosophical issue with the state of healthcare in America, that is disturbing. And the people who are defending conduct like that and justifying someone's murder because of a political position or a philosophical difference about whether healthcare is a human right or capitalism or whatever that debate is, yes, I find that very disturbing. That is an extreme example.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about you referenced the effort to keep the federal government from pursuing the death
Mm,
penalty against him. Let's talk a little bit about capital punishment here in the
okay.
United States. Obviously, it is something that has been inconsistently administered. It was illegal at the federal level for many years. It then became a decision that was left up to the states. Many states have capital punishment laws, including South Carolina. Many do not. Here in the Palmetto State, there was a lengthy period during which executions could not be carried out due to a lack of available means,
Yes.
for lack of a better wording. But
Couldn't get the
now,
drugs.
right, couldn't get the drugs, and there wasn't a shield law in place initially to protect companies that wanted to supply them. Those hiccups have been resolved. There are now additional methods of execution in South Carolina that have been authorized. And you and I have talked about this extensively
Mm.
over the past few months. In November last year, the state of South Carolina began reinstituting capital punishment after a delay of over a dozen years. And we've seen, I believe, 5 executions since then, Allie, 2 of which were performed by a firing squad. And there's been a lot of debate about that, a lot of discussion about that. But here's a question I want to put to you as someone who has expressed a belief that the death penalty is wrong. And I respect that as the Catholic Church, for example, their position on life, unimpeachable. You don't
Mm.
kill. I, as someone who supports capital punishment, have been pleased to see it brought back because I think that it is something that we have to use as a deterrent, or else, again, we're never going to see these reductions in violent crime that we want.
Mm.
And until we start using it as a deterrent, I don't think we use it as a deterrent now, but since it's been reimposed here in South Carolina,
Mhm.
you and I've talked about it, and we've had several conversations. Do you believe that the deaths that these individuals that we've talked about, do you believe the deaths that they experienced were kinder, uh, gentler, more humane than the sentences that they inflicted on their victims? Because we're talking about people who have been shot, people who have been bludgeoned to death with baseball bats, people who have been
Mm.
set on fire. Do you
Mhm.
think that these dainty deaths that these individuals received, how do we equate that? Because I see it and I think, you know what, they got off easy. But I think you see it and say, well, wait a minute, we're still treating them unfairly. What do you think? What's the equivalency there?
So there is not an equivalency. And you say a dainty death. Those men, I believe they're all men, lost their lives. We as a society took their lives from them. Now, I understand that was so first of all, let's back up. Nobody just gets the death penalty, okay? There is a process that happens. There is a trial. There is a guilt phase of the trial where they are found responsible for having, in the case of murder, taken a life. And then there is a penalty phase where a jury decides whether that is an appropriate punishment under the circumstances. That is the law in South Carolina. I have great respect for the law. The law is what I do. Um, I might not always agree with the law from a moral standpoint or a personal beliefs standpoint, but the law is the law. Okay, that is the law. They were tried, they were convicted, and they were sentenced to die. When we start to compare what someone did in breaking the law and committing a heinous crime with what they might deserve as a result of it, that is not, that says more about us than
How
it
so?
does about punishment. Because we, why should we meet brutality with brutality, violence with violence? If we are condemning a person for violent, brutal, depraved behavior, why then would violent, brutal depravity be the appropriate response from a civilized society? That is what we purport to be. Why is that an appropriate response?
You asking?
I am.
Well, I have not adopted any position on the methods other than I
Mm.
support all of the current methods, and
Mhm.
I have actually advocated for bringing back hanging. I think that's something, particularly in cases of child sex abuse, where you've got infants and small children literally raped by people. I think in
Mhm.
those cases, yes, string the bastards up. I think that's merciful. And also, Allie, I don't know how to say this in a polite way, but I think that you talk about humanity in a civilized society, but we look at some of these offenders, and the phrase that keeps coming to my mind is that some of them, I don't know that they're fully humans. I think some of these are animals that need to be put down.
I understand. So, first of all, I think a lot of people share your sentiments. A whole lot of people. I think there is a lot of the American public that is in support of the death penalty. I think there are a lot of people who are opposed to it. And I think a lot of people just either don't think about it or they don't care or they don't have an opinion. But there is no doubt that there are strong feelings on both sides of the argument. My point is this: Of course, we want to live in a society where we don't have people behaving that way. I am a mother. I have 2 girls. If someone ever hurt my child, I cannot imagine in that type of way. I cannot imagine, and God, I hope I never have to go through that, what type of experience that would be. And I'll be honest, I don't know what type of response I would have. And I hope to God that neither of us ever have to make that decision. But as someone who, thank God, is not in that position, and as somebody who is part of the criminal justice system, I look at things in terms of we are supposed to be the adults in the room, right? We are a civilized society. We are supposed to be level-headed. And going back to our initial conversation about justice, we are supposed to decide what is appropriate. And what we decide in a criminal case or what sentence someone gets says just as much about who we are and the message we are sending as a society about ourselves as it does about the person and his behavior. So yes, there has to be punishment for breaking the law.
Mhm.
And the purposes of punishment are not just retribution. That's not the only part of the analysis. Retribution or revenge, like you hurt my child and now you should also hurt just as much. Well, that's one piece of the puzzle. We also have to take into consideration things like deterrence. You mentioned that earlier. You think that the death penalty deters crime.
I think it would if it were implemented broadly. I think it would if it were implemented more than once every 6 weeks or whatever the state of South Carolina is limited. We're actually limited by the courts into how often it can be imposed. So no, I don't think it's a deterrent right now because it's not imposed as a deterrent.
Deterrence, general deterrence and specific deterrence, right? Deterring people. It is the ultimate deterrent for the person who's being executed because they can't ever commit another crime, but also generally a deterrent to other people in society who might commit similar crimes, right?
Yeah.
Rehabilitation. The question that comes up a lot in death penalty cases, is this person irredeemable? Does this person have any potential whatsoever for rehabilitation? And to your point about thinking that some people are animals, there may be people for a number of reasons who cannot be rehabilitated. And I understand that that is sometimes the case. There may be a number of reasons for that. Mental health issues, a history of trauma. We don't know what's happened to that person. And I'm not saying that in the context of making an excuse for bad behavior. I'm saying that we have to understand why people do what they do. And we have to send a message when we punish people, when we sentence people, not just to deter others, but also that we have some semblance of humanity in ourselves, that we don't believe that people commit a crime and we throw them away or we treat them like an animal. We
But
have to be
when people show
civilized.
us who they are, we ought to believe them. And some crimes are such a visible manifestation of evil that it's hard to, again, whether or not in a cosmic sense they deserve redemption, but you use that term irredeemable, and I find that a very interesting term because, Christians, everybody that just went through Easter, the whole notion of redemption is central to that faith. The notion of vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Certainly, these are teachings of Jesus Christ that would appear on their surface to advocate against, punishments like the death penalty. But then we see, and I want to give you this example, this case in Texas. Just this week, prosecutors in Texas agreed to life imprisonment for the mass killer of 23, again, targeted. This was a targeted crime against Latinos, a targeted attack against Mexican Americans, against Mexicans at an El Paso Walmart. 23 people were killed. Now, the prosecutors say they took into account the wishes of the victims' families who wanted a swifter resolution. They didn't want a drawn out process of decades of appeals, which is another reason the death penalty is not a deterrent, because it takes 20 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawyers to
It should
pull off.
take a long time and a lot of money to take the most extreme
When a guy's,
action in a case
I'm sorry, but when a
when
guy's
you're going
on
to take
video
someone's life.
literally targeting the older Mexicans who can't run away faster, that guy deserves.
Well, he
Okay.
pled guilty.
I know he pled guilty, but he pled guilty to avoid the consequence he should have received for his crime, in my estimation. Well, let's talk about, though,
I don't
federal.
think the answer is to make it go faster and skip steps and cut corners with due process, but carry on.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. Let's talk about some of those cases, though, that have been at various stages of the federal appellate process. 40 individuals, as of last year, were on federal government's death row. Former President Joe Biden pardoned 37 of them, left 3 of them on death row.
Pardoned them or commuted their
Commuted,
sentences?
correct. Absolutely. You are absolutely correct.
I
They are
wasn't
not
trying to
set
be
free. No,
cute. I was
no,
just
no, you're
okay.
correct. They were not set free. They're
Yes.
serving life in prison. Their death sentences were commuted,
Mm,
absolutely. But
mm.
one of the 3 whose sentence was not commuted, a case very near and dear to the hearts of a lot of folks in South Carolina, the case of Dylan Roof,
Mm.
the Mother Emanuel killer who, by his own admission, perpetrated a hate crime 10 years ago at the Mother Emanuel Church down in Charleston,
Mhm.
deliberately targeting Black parishioners, killing 9 of them, one of them a state senator and pastor, the late Clementa Pinckney. Joe Biden allowed that sentence to stand, but yet these other cases, and I read up on some of these cases, they're horrific.
Mm.
Some of these murders that were committed. I guess my question, Allie, is what's the equivalency there? And I asked you that earlier. What's the equivalency between the victims of Dylan Roof and the victims of these dozens of other killers who were allowed to evade the consequences of their actions?
Well, I don't know that there is an equivalency. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, we do not have the benefit of the full picture. We can read up on a case, we can read news stories about it, but there are things about the circumstances of that crime or the victims or the defendants that we don't know. And the judge is the best suited. The parties to that case are the best suited to know the answers to those questions. Now, going back to your what's the question about whether that was an appropriate
How does any, and we'll talk about the political fallout from Biden's
mm,
decision, but how does someone justify commuting one sentence, not commuting another
I don't know
when
the
the
answer to that.
when they're both
I don't.
cold-blooded killers,
I'm
correct?
not in Joe Biden's head, thank God.
Is Joe Biden in Joe
I
Biden's head?
don't on any given day, that's questionable.
Well,
I don't know.
let's talk about the politics of it, though, because
Sure.
obviously one of the top Democrat leaders in South Carolina, hopeful for higher office, some that many believe would make a credible Democrat nominee for Attorney General, perhaps even governor, David Pasco, solicitor in the South Carolina First Circuit, a very tough on crime prosecutor with a long record there in the Orangeburg, Calhoun area.
Mhm.
David Pasco cited Joe Biden's commutation of those sentences as a reason for him to switch parties.
Mhm.
He has left the Democrat Party as a result of that and some other things we can talk about. But does it feel to you when things like that happen, when prosecutors like Pasco say, you know what, I was with you guys for decades, but I'm out. This is enough. I mean, does that not signal that, as you mentioned, that paradigm is shifting a bit on this issue?
Well, I think there might be a number of reasons for that. First of all, Solicitor Pasco is an incredibly talented trial lawyer. He is a very effective solicitor. I agree with you. He's one of the best of the best. And I understand his knowing what he does and what he spent his career doing. It does not surprise me that that was a decision with which he disagreed. Now, what factored in his decision to switch parties, I have no idea.
We're going to know about that in a few
I
weeks,
don't
right?
know why we need prosecutors to have political affiliation in the first place, but that's probably a conversation for another day.
That's
I
a
don't
good
know
point.
why our prosecutor, whose job is supposed to be to pursue justice, I don't know why it matters whether there's a red R or a blue D next to his or her name.
Sheriffs, too. I mean, all of them.
Again, separate issue. But I think there are a lot of people that probably share Solicitor Pasco's frustration or bewilderment about those types of decisions, especially in the context in which they were made. It almost seemed like I'm going out the door, let me go ahead and, I guess do a bunch
Also,
of
it was a
stuff
bit self-serving.
before I leave, perhaps. But I understand why. Uh, Knowing him and the career that he's built and what he does and how he serves the people of South Carolina, I understand why that is concerning to him or why that might lead him to make a different choice for himself personally. And that, again, that is a personal choice. I don't think it's going to change a single thing about what an effective prosecutor, trial lawyer, or human being David Pasco is. I don't. Whether he runs for attorney general or not, whether he does it as a Democrat or a Republican, that might affect his ability to win a statewide election in the state of South Carolina. But I don't think it's going to change one bit the dedication that he has to ethically and fairly prosecute crimes in the state of South Carolina, whether he's doing that as the First Circuit solicitor, whether he's doing that as the Attorney General. I don't
You
think
did
it
a great
matters.
job earlier breaking down for our audience kind of how this works. And just to reiterate, in South Carolina, in a capital case,
Mm.
there is a determination of guilt by a jury.
Or trial, a regular trial.
Trial, like
Mhm.
Alec Murdaugh's trial. Only at the end
Hopefully
of
not
that,
like Alec Murdaugh's
well,
trial.
correct. But yeah, hopefully not like the jury in Alec Murdaugh's trial, but at any
Oh,
rate.
now you're going to go off on a tirade.
Oh, no, no, no. I'm going to keep it focused. But after that trial, if a jury determines guilt
Mhm.
on the part of the accused,
Mhm.
you had it absolutely correct. There's a separate proceeding during which that same jury determines whether or not the death penalty is warranted. And
Yes.
prosecutors, having proven guilt, now must prove the aggregating factors that are listed in our statute. I believe
Yes.
there's a dozen of them,
Mhm.
which warrant death.
Mhm.
And we've written a lot of articles about those factors. But let me ask you this. A couple of the cases that we've talked about over the last couple months seem to be kind of on the edge of whether or not those factors were
Mm.
were deserved. And obviously a jury determined they were. But we
Mhm.
talked about one where a guy walked into a store uh,
Richard
unarmed,
Moore.
uh, acquired a weapon during an altercation, and then used it. And that qualified because it was an armed weapon during a robbery. And your argument during that discussion we had was, well, was this really an armed robbery? He didn't go in there with a weapon. He obtained one during a struggle. Is that the kind of case where you feel it detracts from those statutory principles, or do you think a case like that upholds them, or what should the criteria be? Let me ask you that.
Oh, well, I'm not in any position to decide what the criteria should be. Listen, the law is the law, and our job as officers of the court, our job as members of this community that work in the criminal justice space, we follow the law. Sometimes we challenge the law, but we have to do that through appropriate channels. So I'm not here to say what that criteria should be. That's the legislature's job. What I am comfortable doing or saying is how I think that reflects on us as a society. Now, Richard's case, I think, in particular, was upsetting, like you just outlined, because of the circumstances of the crime. And whether, had Richard been tried and gone through the penalty phase today versus when he did, would the outcome have been different? I think that there is a distinct possibility that that outcome would have been different. And also, I happen to know a little bit more about Richard's case than I do about other people's cases for various reasons. But I believe that it should be part of the analysis of how someone conducts himself or what he does after all hope is lost.
What do you mean by that? Like,
If I am convicted for murder and I am sentenced to life in prison or I am sentenced to death, I have absolutely zero incentive to be a decent human being at that point because my fate is sealed. I know that I'm going to die or I'm never going to get out of prison. So why should I behave in a way that reflects any semblance of morality or decency? What incentive do I have to be a good person? And the answer is I have no incentive at all. And Richard Moore was tried, convicted, sentenced to die, and knew that he was going to die. And yet his conduct, his behavior, the life that he lived in the South Carolina Department of Corrections on death row was nothing short of extraordinary.
mm-hmm.
He personified this concept of redemption or I'll use a Christianity reference or a reference from Judaism, teshuva, or the return to what you know is right. And he had no reason to do that. He had no incentive to do that. But something in Richard Moore as a person took responsibility and made changes and decided that he was going to take the years that he had, whether they were years in prison, whether they were, 5 years, 10 years. He was going to take the years that he had left, and he was going to do everything that he could to be a good person, do everything that he could to encourage other people, to mentor others in the Department of Corrections who maybe had some life left for them on the other side. He didn't have to do that. And he had no incentive to do that, and yet he did. And so to me, that shows that this is a person who has proven that he is redeemable, that he has the ability to reform, that he has the ability to be rehabilitated, because he's done it for himself against all odds in the most difficult of contexts and with absolutely zero incentive. And so that fact alone, I think, should give us pause. And is this the type of person whose life we should take? Because there are other people, I don't know Dylan Roof, I've never met him, but I would imagine he ain't sorry.
Correct.
And he might sit here in a chair and say, and I would do it again. And he might be one of those people that you look into their eyes and there's no humanity there. And so we put Richard Moore to death. We put Dylan Roof to death. Are we saying that they are the
Are you
same?
throwing my equivalency question back
I
at me?
am.
That's
I'm
pretty
throwing it
good.
back at you. Are
No
they the
wonder you're so good at
same?
what you do.
And I
No, I
think
don't
the
think
answer
they
to
are.
that is hell no, they're not the same. And so that is the push and pull. That's the analysis. That's the stopping and thinking. Is this actually what we ought to be doing as a society? I have heard so many people say, listen, I'm not pro death penalty, but if ever there was a case for the death penalty, Dylan Roof is it. I hear that a lot.
Clearly, whoever signs Joe Biden's papers felt the same.
I hear that a lot. And so, I look at things like the death of Richard Moore. We killed him. And then I look at someone like Dylan Roof and I think they are not the same. They both committed heinous acts of violence. They took human life, but they are not the same.
Mm.
And every case is not the same, which is why I think the analysis of the factors that the federal government does a much better job of outlining by statute. The nature and circumstances of the offense itself, of course, that's an obvious one. The history and characteristics of the person accused or convicted. And then also taking into consideration what we have to think about when we punish somebody. Deterrence, rehabilitation, restitution, the victims. They're not the same. And so, yes.
Well, and I wanted to bring that case up. I wanted to bring
Okay.
the Richard Moore case up because it is one statutorily. It kind of teeters on the line there, and there were several very conservative, tough on crime people who actually lobbied Governor Henry McMaster for clemency in Moore's
Yeah.
case, including John Osment, the former
Yeah.
corrections director. A lot of folks went to bat for him, but I go back, Allie, to the fundamental question, and the reason I didn't editorialize in favor of a commutation in that instance was I felt the jury in that case made their call.
Yeah.
And we are so bent on these jury verdicts, and I understand that there's questions about them in the Murdoch case, but if we have no evidence that a jury decision wasn't based on the facts, how do we go back and overturn that? A jury of his
Yeah.
peers made that decision, not only that he was guilty, but that the prosecutors proved beyond a reasonable doubt, same standard, that the death penalty criteria was warranted based on aggravating factors.
Yeah. I understand. I think that's a perfectly reasonable perspective. I understand where you're coming from, and I think it is so important that we respect a jury's decision. The jury is the most important group of people in that room, and they are the only ones that have the ability to decide the facts in the case. They don't have the ability to decide what the law is. Only the judge can do that, but we have to respect jury's decisions unless we have a reason not to.
I haven't said that. Let me concede something to you. There are numerous cases we have covered here at FITSNews. The death of Samantha Lee Josephson, for example, just a graphic stabbing death. So many cases we've covered where I believe that the punishment of death, which wasn't handed down because it wasn't sought by prosecutors for whatever reason. I believe that there are cases that are much more warranting of a death sentence than the circumstances surrounding Richard Moore. So absolutely no doubt about that. I guess there are still victims in the Moore case, though. There are still individuals whose lives were forever shattered as a result of it. And there is still, again, to me, I'm not saying every murder deserves the death penalty. We were talking earlier, and you, I think, as a talking point, I guess, kind of threw that out there. I don't believe every murder deserves the death penalty. However, I believe at some point, when we look at the escalating violence and you talk about a civilized society, I look at my X feed, Allie. I don't see a civilized society. I see Fight Club on the streets spilling over, uh, people shooting each other over road rage. I don't see a civilized society. And I think that part of that is that people, due in large part to a justice system that hasn't respected victims, that hasn't upheld the rule of law that we both are so passionate about. I think that's why it's out of control. I think that's one of the reasons that it's out of control. And until we start actively imposing tougher sentences, including, I believe, the widespread application of capital punishment, I think we're going to continue to see that. You disagree, but tell me.
No, it's not that I disagree. I think that's one tiny piece of the puzzle. Um, I just don't think that, and I know that this is not what you're saying, but we resume executions at a higher rate than we have in the past, that all of a sudden people are going to start behaving the way that they're supposed to behave. I think there are a lot of reasons why things are in the state that they're in this country right now, in a lot of contexts. And also, yes, I see the same thing when I go on the internet, which is why I've tried really hard lately not to spend as much time on the internet, because I think we're inundated with this picture of what we think society is. And yes, we have a lot of people behaving badly and a lot of people committing crimes and not treating other people with humanity. But again, we are supposed to be above all of that, regardless of what the people on the streets are doing or the people out on Twitter are saying or the people here or there are doing or how they're behaving. We, as the institutions of justice in this country, in a civilized country, we have to be and we should be above all of that. And we should be making decisions and making policy and implementing these things in a way that sends a message that regardless of the chaos that is going on, we are going to take the moral high road. We are going to do the right thing. We are going to prioritize fairness and justice, no matter what somebody else's behavior is. That is so important. We cannot have a reactionary approach to criminal justice. We can't, because then we become no better than the bad actors that are creating chaos in the streets. We cannot. That's why we don't have vigilante justice. We have to be cool-headed. We have to be rational, and we have to be fair. And that doesn't mean, and I know that this is not what you're advocating for, but that doesn't mean that every single case deserves the maximum penalty, just like it means that every single case doesn't deserve the most leniency. There are people who probably deserve no leniency whatsoever, just like there are people who don't deserve the maximum penalty just because the crime was particularly heinous. And so I think we have to resist the urge to say that our response to chaos and bad behavior has to also be this aggressive, chaotic, just yeehaw response to what's going on. We have to be cool-headed.
Could you fathom a case here in South Carolina where you would, on a personal level, support the imposition of a death sentence? Like a dirty bomb that kills hundreds, or a mass shooting that breaks the Las Vegas record for body count, or a religious Jim Jones mass suicide where they poison. I mean, can you think of any scenario where you'd say, yeah, I'm okay with it there?
I don't know the answer to that, but what I can tell, I can't think of something. What I can tell you is that is the law in South Carolina, and I have a great deal of respect for the law. That's not to say that I will not fight to change things about the law that I believe need to be changed, or to take a stand on policy issues that I feel strongly about. I generally do not believe that the government should take human life. I don't. I believe that, I don't want to get religious, but I think that our souls are more meaningful than just we're here and we appeared. I'll leave it at that. I think that human beings have inherent value for reasons that go beyond just us. And it's not the typical argument of we mess it up so many times and we get it so wrong and we've executed innocent people or we've convicted innocent people. That does happen, and it happens way more often than it should, but that's not the basis of my argument. I think that there's something bigger there. I think that human beings inherently have dignity. I think that their lives have value. And it's because of that that I cannot imagine a scenario where I would say, yes, the human institution of government has the authority and should take a human life. But that is just my opinion. And I respect the fact that probably 50% of the country disagrees with me, but I love that. That's why we're having this conversation. And these are conversations that should be had because, there might come a time in my life or a circumstance that arises that might change my mind. That can happen to all of us. We experience life, we learn things, and hopefully we change for the better and we grow. And sometimes that means changing our opinions on very important issues. And I would hope that I would be mature enough and humble enough to be receptive to that type of change. I'm not talking about this issue specifically necessarily, but any issue, right?
No, I'm
I'm
glad.
not, I'm not the ultimate authority on what is or isn't moral, right? All I can say is this is how I feel, this is what I feel strongly about, this is what I believe. And to answer your question, no, I can't think of something where I would say, yes, I think the government should take that person's life. Now, that's not to say that I don't believe that they shouldn't have extreme consequences for extreme bad behavior. That is also part of a civilized society. You break the law, you have a consequence.
Well, I'm glad you pushed back because, and I said earlier that you put me in my place. I think a better way to say it probably is that every time we engage on an issue, I walk away thinking about what you've said and what you say, your arguments, the examples, or even sometimes your very direct way of criticizing. Very blunt. You're very blunt, but you're
Well,
very good at
I
it.
say
And
I say what I
it
mean and I
makes me
mean what I
think.
say.
It makes me think. And so and one of the things that made me think of what you were saying earlier, we obviously disagree on this issue, but I think one
Mm,
of the things you just said about that eternal
mm,
concept, I think we both believe in a just God, a Deo Justo. I think we both believe that ultimately uh, the the wheel comes back around. Just like energy can't be created or destroyed, there is an ultimate accountability. It may not
yeah.
be what you think it should be. It may
Mm,
not be what I think it should be, but there will be accountability in the end for everything we do, whether it's
mhm.
these incredibly graphic crimes or just the simple lies we tell each other in everyday life. So I do think we agree on that. In a larger moral sense, I don't think there's anything we can do on this side of the mortal coil that's going to impact that lasting justice.
Mm.
Maybe I'm off there, but
We'll find out someday.
before you go, I just have to say, if folks are not following on Instagram, we're going to put this account up here. I'm going to make
Oh
sure Dylan
God.
gets this up here, but you are killing it on social media, and you just started a couple months ago,
Yeah. Probably
and
about a month or two
so
ago.
I was one of your first followers, right?
Thanks.
Right, yeah. But it's awesome, and it's a mix of cases like this, serious
Mhm.
stuff. You've got commentary on different pop culture shows. But if you aren't following it already, please check out Allie's Insta page, or is that the preferred
Yep, sure. Or
Insta? Or
TikTok,
you're on
Allie
the TikTok.
Benevento, SLF. That's me.
We'll put them up there. Allie
Yeah.
Benevento from the Strom Law Firm. Thank you for doing this. Come back. We'll have you on. We'll dive into some deeper stuff next time too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.